Spitfire Audio's reputation as a maker and creator of sample library content for media composers was established early on with the release of Albion, its very first orchestral sample library. But if you work as a composer for film or television or advertising or production music, of course what you're really interested in, first and foremost, is emotion. If the right sound to underpin the emotional gravitas of a particular scene can be sourced from an orchestral sample library, then great. But what if a sound needs to come from somewhere else? What if the right sound for that particular scene needs to come from another instrument? What Spitfire Audio have understood from the very outset is that there is a magic that comes from putting microphones in front of instruments. Of course, what they're trying to do, first and foremost, is to capture the very essence of the way that those instruments sound. But of course, every recording is unique, and the magic and the wonder that comes from a real performance produced by a musician being recorded is fundamental to what Spitfire Audio's sample libraries have always been. And if you take those source recordings and give them to sound programmers who are interested in further mining them, going after the adventure playground qualities that they have from a sonic point of view, you end up with a really interesting collection of instruments which are sort of hybrid. They almost sound electronic, even though they've come from recorded, sampled sources. Through the course of the next 3 videos, we're going to look at some of those sample libraries, placing them in the context of an electronic music production. In the first episode, we're going to look at analog-style, biting, percussive synth sequences, and we're going to see how they can provide drama and tension and really push a track forward. In the second film, we're going to explore the lush richness of melodic instruments, lead lines sourced from felt grand pianos and other instruments. And in the third film, we're going to create a hybrid drum world, a place where electronic drum sounds can mix with huge acoustic drum sources to produce drama and extra power in the track. Let's go and get started now. Let's take this track to pieces. We're going to start by looking at some of the pitched rhythmic sequences which are driving this track forward. So let's start with this first loop. This comes from the Glass and Steel library, and it gives us an opportunity to explore the eDNA engine, which is at the heart of quite a lot of Spitfire's interfaces. What we've got here is a chance to set up 2 sounds mapped to A and B, and we have this oscillate mixer here which allows us to set a balance between those 2 sound sources. So you can hear that here I've got a bass line on the first part and this sort of ticking sequence on the second, and set in the middle we get a nice balance between both sounds. We can do other things to the sounds as well. We've got both low and high pass filters for both sides. We've got an opportunity to tune the individual elements, pan them, change their volume relative to one another, and so on and so forth. So we've got quite a lot of control. Also within this engine we have 3 LFOs which we could map to volume, to pitch and to filter. Underneath, we've got a gate sequencer, and you can see that this is in operation on this particular sound. What this is doing is chopping the sound up in terms of its volume, giving us a nice spiky rhythmic sequence. And we also have this gate volume control, which allows me to control how hard the sequencer is working when it comes to working with this particular sound and gating its volume. So let's dial a little bit more and less of that in to hear what it's doing. So you can hear that when it's being gated hard, it's really spiky, but we want this kind of middle ground, nice little bit of sequencing, gate sequencing, without it becoming too much. So what we've got now is a sound which is nicely balanced between these 2 elements, and it's gating nicely as well. So it's providing this quite rhythmic, quite spiky backbone to the track. Now on this particular channel, I've also got a compressor, the Pro C2 from FabFilter, and you can see that at the very top of the arrange screen, I've got a side chain trigger which is set up. And what that's doing is just feeding a little bit of signal into the compressor so that the sequence starts ducking a little bit. This is a really popular technique. So to show you how this is set up, you can see that I've got a kick drum signal, which is not being routed to the main output at all, but instead to auxiliary bus number 1. And over here on aux 1, you can also hear that I've turned off the output so that we're not actually hearing this signal. It's like a ghost trigger. So when I press play, you can see that with this track unmuted, whilst we're getting signal internally within Logic, we're not actually hearing it. And what that means is that when I route this sound into the compressor, you'll see that the two signals come together and we just get a little bit of volume ducking. So that's just keeping things moving a little bit, and that's a technique we'll be using on some of the other sequence sounds as well. Let's bring in the second one now. Oliver Arnolds from Kiasmos has developed this fantastic library. It contains this fantastic grand piano, which we'll be hearing later on in the series, but it also contains lots of other sounds, pads and atmospheres, and also some lovely rhythms as well. So this sound is from that library. So we've got this lovely sort of dusty low drone sitting underneath the track, providing this kind of bass layer which is constantly moving. As you can see, this is using a different interface, but again we've got some similar controls. Filters, those same wobbles, those LFOs, which are available to us if we want them, as well as envelope control over attack, decay, sustain and release. And like all Spitfire libraries, we've also got internal effects, and you can see that I've got some delay assigned to this sound as well. So if we run these two sounds together, we can hear the beginnings of the kind of pitched rhythmical elements of this track. So we've got two separate pulse sequences coming from two separate Spitfire audio libraries. Let's add some more. When people think about Spitfire audio, they tend to think of orchestral sample collections. But of course, if you've made all those recordings and you're prepared to put them in the hands of sample programmers who have an interest in making new and original sounds out of sample content of all descriptions, you get some really interesting results. And we're going to see that in the next sound that we're going to put into this track. So eDNA Earth contains these separate sort of sound cartridges with these great names: Dystopia, Sound Swamp, Disco Man, Movie Drome, Analogonaut and Dysphoria, which sort of hint at the sorts of sounds that you'll find within each separate category. I'm using it for this kind of dusty sound called plucked synth ARP, which is just giving us, well, this sound. So this is picking up on the kind of dusty character that we got from the Oliver Arnolds collection as well, which is just giving us this slightly sort of textured sound. And of course with this one we've got a slightly higher pitch, which means that we've got something just approaching a sort of a more harmonic part, which is just going to sit in the middle of the track. And you can see that even though the colours are different, we're looking again at the same interface that we had before. Again, with all of the same controls, filters, envelopes, the oscillate mixer to set a balance between sounds, and the gate sequencer, although actually that's not engaged for this particular sound. This sound is kind of spiky all by itself. So if we put this new part in with the previous parts as well, we get this. So we've got a little bit of colour in the mid-range, and we've got just something which is filling out the harmony a little bit to give us this slightly brooding sense of what the track's going to go on and become. It's kind of hard to imagine that this sound was sourced from orchestral recordings, but you begin to see what happens when you've got great sample material to work with. The fourth element we're going to look at is a very different type of sound, and this is from Evo Grid. Now what Evo Grid gives you is a whole series of rhythms, and this particular Evo Grid is based on string recordings. Now the way that the grid works is that you can see that there are all of these separate slots which are available in different key ranges. So in other words, if I trigger a key, Each of these positions allows me to hear a different rhythmic pattern, either made up of pizzicato or staccato notes from the string players, which I can then group together so that when I play over the keyboard I can trigger different types of rhythms and patterns. So to show you what I mean, let's start with this note. So here we've got some low strings playing this particular rhythm. If I play this note, now we've got much higher strings playing a pizzicato pattern. Put them together. So you can hear the two rhythms are separate, the articulation is separate, but of course they fit together and produce this really nice, interesting pattern. And we can go further, mapping more rhythms across other keys. So you can see how you can build up a really nice, complex series of rhythms which add something really cinematic to the texture. So I've got all these different rhythms available to me. Now the part that I've sequenced starts out with just two notes in the sort of lower register, and then it gets a bit fuller in this section over here. Let's just hear how that unfolds. So you can hear we've got a combination of pizzicato, plucked notes, and bowed ones, short little bows, which are just giving us this slightly cinematic sound, really. So now, let's put this new Evo Grid part in with the other parts, and to see where we're at with this whole kind of sequence element of the track. By the way, Evo Grid has also got a sidechain compressor on it, which is producing the ducking technique that we looked at earlier. Here's the whole lot together. So you can see that here we're just starting out with a couple of notes from Evo Grid, and then the arrangement gets a bit denser, bringing in a couple more rhythms in this section we heard just a moment ago. So now we've got a really interesting hybrid situation happening. We've got some very obviously synthetic sounds, and we've got some string sounds producing a sort of acoustic flavour as well. The two things are working really nicely together. So the next part we're going to add is from the first Enigma library by Leo Abrahams. He's made two libraries for Spitfire Audio now. Leo Abrahams, of course, being the musician, composer, multi-instrumentalist who's worked with John Hopkins, Imogen Heap, Brian Eno and countless other people. Amazingly prolific guy. And what we've got here is this really interesting library of sounds that have been taken from his guitar work. So he likes to plug his guitar into pedals, and he likes to take those recordings and chop them up and produce all kinds of crazy noises from them. And you can see from the folder names we've got here that he sourced all sorts of different types of sounds from them. We've got pads and loops and various warped textures as well, and they're really great for tracks like this where you're looking for something which is kind of visceral and biting. So this little Enigma sequence, which is just called Capture, produces this sound. So it's just pulsing up and down over an octave, but you can see that I've added bit crushing to it as well, just here within the main interface, so that it's just close. It's sounding really nice and close. So whereas some of the other atmospheric textures are a little bit further back in the mix, this one's really close and it's biting and it's just giving us a little bit of aggression. We've got one more sound to add as well. I've added a sort of dark pad to the mix. This is also from the eDNA Earth library, and this one has also got a sidechain compressor set up on it so that we've got that ducking technique that we looked at earlier on, and that sounds like this. What what I really like about this sound is that obviously it's a pad and it's given this really nice floating texture, but it's got some rhythm, some movement in it, and we're adding to that by also feeding it the sidechain signal into the compression treatment, so we're getting this kind of sucking effect, which we'll hear in a moment. But this also gives us a chance to go a little bit further into the eDNA engine and particularly look at effects provision, which is amazing within this library. So here, down here, I've got this effects and motor tab. And within this, I have a chance to go and look at effects across the board for this particular sound. So we have master effects, which obviously affect both sound sources, A and B, together at the output stage. But we also have separate effect slots for the sounds in Bay A, the sounds in part B as well, the second section. We've got auxiliary effects and we've got motor effects. So we've got loads and loads of extra effects that we can bring to the sounds. So I'm using 3 separate auxiliary effects here, and the advantage of using those internally is, of course, is that they're being produced as part of the original sound, which means that when I add a sidechain compressor, the effects are ducking as well as the original source sound too. So let's put them all together so we can hear what we've got. You can probably hear that I've got an auto panner, the Pan-Man plugin on this part from Leo Abrahams as well, which is just giving us a little bit of stereo movement so that the part's moving from left to right. So we've got a really nice collection of sounds now, some really obviously synthetic, synthesized ones, and with the strings in particular, some sounds from the acoustic world as well. Put them together and we get this really nice hybrid collection. So now what we've got is a backbone for a track. We're going to add some new things to it as well, but for our sequence section, we're done for now.